All right, well, hello there. So, today we're going to be talking about the power and techniques of two of history's orators. One is a relatively good speaker, and one is more of an obviously evil historical figure who also happened to be able to command an audience. So, I'm sure you might be able to guess who the evil speaker is. And that's because he's one of the most commonly depicted authoritarian leaders of all time. So anyway, as I often joke, this is where I would have some intro music if I actually had a professionally done podcast, but instead it's just me talking into my Chromebook. But anyway, welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory, where we sometimes look at some voices of history, and we explore the art of public speaking at times through the lens of some of the most influential figures in history. Today we're diving into the oratory skills of two pivotal leaders, Abraham Lincoln, who is the relatively good guy, and the more overtly evil Adolf Hitler. Now, I almost shouldn't need to say this, but I'm aware of the age we live in. When I talk about Hitler's skills as a speaker, I'm not endorsing his views in any way. I'm not saying I agree with anything he says. So, just so you know, if Hitler says the sky is blue in a speech, I actually assume he's wrong. So, there you go. I've gotten that little bit out of the way, although I'm going to reiterate that point further down the line. But first, I've got to move onward here. So, despite their vastly different ideologies and impacts, both men commanded the attention of their audiences through powerful speech techniques. So, let's uncover how they mastered the art of persuasion and the lasting legacy, for good or for ill, of their words. The journey begins with Abraham Lincoln, partially because he actually was alive first. So he's a man whose speeches have echoed through the annals of history. I think everybody's heard of Abraham Lincoln. I almost said Adolf, but Abraham Lincoln, one of the most famous images that appears into a person's mind is that stovetop hat, which a lot of people wouldn't be able to pull off, but he made it look just so awesome. That's a little bit of praise for him right off the bat. He knew how to wear that hat and make it look good. Now, my understanding is he didn't wear it all the time, and maybe he just took it out for a few occasions, and few famous photographs were taken of him where he just happened to have it on. I don't know. But I'm getting a little sidetracked here. That's what happens when you're riffing and veering off the script. But, supposedly podcast listeners like that. But anyway, Abraham Lincoln's voice, described as booming and articulate, was coupled with a finely honed intellect that set him apart as a speaker trained to high standards. So one of his, in addition to the Gettysburg Address, he also gave a speech at the Lyceum event. And I don't know if I'm even pronouncing that correctly, but Lyceum. One of his contemporaries, named Herndon, heard him speak at that event, and he recalled that it wasn't exactly Lincoln's greatness as an orator that struck him, but the philosophical, amusing, and masterly way Lincoln communicated. His speeches were clear and distinct, demonstrating that true oratory mastery isn't just about volume or flair, but about clarity and purpose. And I think Lincoln definitely had a lot of that. And as I noted on my blog called Status Quo Defenders, Lincoln was also flawed. despite being against slavery. But part of what makes him great is that at times he was not content with just saying, we are determined to perpetuate our religious and political institutions or something along those lines. But during Lincoln's address in this speech in question, he indirectly blamed slavery for lawlessness in the United States, noting, quote, whenever the vicious portion of our population shall be permitted to gather in bands of hundreds and thousands and burn churches, ravage and rob provision stores, throw printing presses into rivers, shoot editors, and hang and burn obnoxious persons at pleasure and with impunity, depend upon it, this government cannot last. So there Lincoln was referring to the murder of abolitionist Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. So, he had a way of, speaking truth, and it most likely convinced some people to become, anti-slavery because of his way of noting how the pro-slavery position actually was not about law and order so much as it was about prolonging injustice. And when, certain people were challenging that injustice, well, the pro-slavery contingent of society would run amok at times. So I think that was a very skillful way to approach the issue at the time, and it was a point that I think a lot of people could quite simply understand. It was a very plain observation about how the status quo was more destructive than it was orderly, although it was obviously being perpetuated in the name of order and lawfulness and all of that kind of stuff. But, Lincoln's style was straightforward and effective, resonating deeply with his audience through simplicity and directness, and that was just a pretty good example. I mean, obviously you could look at other Lincoln speeches and, find some perhaps more famous quotes that he's stated, but that to me is still a pretty solid example of how he could look at a series of real life events and sort of make a snapshot of them in his speech and convey his point in a very plain and straightforward way. So now let's contrast this with another historical figure known for his public speaking, albeit for more nefarious purposes, Adolf Hitler, that scumbag. So Hitler's rise as a powerful orator was no accident. His speeches were the result of natural talent. As much as I hate to say that about him, he did have a knack for conveying a message. He no doubt practiced extensively, and he had strategic use of rhetorical techniques. So how did he achieve such command over his audience? So yes, we're going to discuss a little bit Hitler's techniques at controlling and manipulating his crowds. So Hitler owned his skills through rigorous practice and constant feedback. He paid close attention to his audience's reactions, refining his approach continuously. This goal-directed practice, coupled with targeted feedback, was critical to his development as a speaker, just as it would be for so many other speakers, whether they are having a wholesome message or they're just downright evil. So obviously I'm not being such a good speaker during this podcast, especially when I'm improvising, but I'm also not as nefarious and evil. But practice and feedback are critical to learning. Hitler spent a significant amount of time, crafting his speaking skills and all that kind of stuff. So he was also working with Joseph Goebbels, or I've heard it pronounced Goebbels, even though there's no R in there. But anyway, Joe was his propaganda minister. Hitler mastered the art of nonverbal communication as well. And, his rallies would tend to be spectacles. I've also heard somewhere, now I don't know if this is true, but I'd believe it, that he would arrive late to his speeches to build up anticipation and to increase psychological tension so he could sort of better manipulate the audience. And you know what? Somebody else who is kind of famous now for showing up late to his speeches, Donald Trump. Oh no. That might have been a technique that DJT had learned from this nefarious figure. And we all know that Donald Trump actually had a book of speeches by Hitler that he apparently kept by his bedside table, which is freakish as hell. It's a matter of discussion that actually was happening back when Barbara Walters had interviewed him. I think probably in the early 1990s. I mean, you can watch the clip on YouTube where she brings the topic up, and he's like, yes, I had the book. It was gifted me by some person who may or may not have been Jewish. I guess the person actually wasn't Jewish, but good old Don had to, be a weasel about it and pretend that it's okay that he's got that by his bedside table because it's gifted to him by some Jewish dude. Wacky stuff. Wacky and scary and odd. But, that's the type of person he is. But anyway, his dramatic gestures and intense facial expressions. Now I'm talking about Hitler now, not 34 for 45. I'm talking about Hitler. Anyway, he had dramatic gestures and intense facial expressions that added layers of engagement to his speeches. Would these techniques still be effective today? Yes, they would. Some argue that in the age of digital media and instant communication, the impact might differ, but the fundamentals of engaging an audience remain the same. So, if anything, I think he would have a larger audience today, which is scary. And, we're kind of seeing that with the resurgence of neo-fascism throughout the world. Thankfully, there are still some forces keeping it at bay at this moment. But I gotta say, I'm not as confident as I once was that those forces are going to stay prevailing. But his intense facial expressions conveyed emotion and conviction, which helped to draw in his audience. His voice modulation was another key aspect of his oratory skills. Hitler skillfully shifted from soft tones to loud, forceful ones, and it was what he did to maintain attention and emphasize crucial points. He also employed rhetorical techniques like repetition and simple language to make his messages clear and memorable. So that's one of the, whatever your intention, that's one of the main approaches to delivering an impactful speech, is to try to keep your language relatively simple and keep it clear and memorable. So, despite the effectiveness of his methods, it's important to remember the dark purpose they served. Hitler's speeches were meticulously crafted to manipulate and inspire his audience, often scapegoating minorities and promising simple solutions to complex problems. And of course, often spreading paranoid delusions regarding the groups that he was targeting. What we nowadays are more likely to call conspiracy theories. And scapegoating and promising solutions were indeed appealing to a populace that was desperate for change. They wanted, the idea of greatness, and it was easy to tap into their prejudices and fears, and any sort of success that came along just served the purpose of, promoting the supposedly grand vision of the Fuhrer. So both Lincoln and Hitler demonstrate that oratory is a powerful tool capable of inspiring greatness or causing immense harm. While Lincoln's speeches continue to be celebrated for their wisdom and clarity, Hitler's serve as a cautionary tale of how persuasive speech can be used for manipulation, control, and death and destruction. So, as we reflect on these two historical figures, we see that effective public speaking combines natural talent, rigorous practice, and a deep understanding of one's audience. Whether used for good or ill, the power of words is undeniable. So, imagine closing music here, because that's basically what I have to say for this episode. But I would like to thank you for joining us, or joining me, on this episode of Critical Weight Theory, where we looked at these two different voices of history. If you enjoyed this exploration into the art of oratory, please, listen to other episodes. Maybe leave a review of this podcast if you want. I don't necessarily care that much if it's positive or negative. Just feel free to do that. Like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. I forgot that YouTube recently added an RSS feed, so now my podcast can easily be made available on, that particular and well-known streaming platform. So, we're going to occasionally look into some more historical speeches and other influential figures at some point in the future. I don't know how common it's going to be as a theme of this podcast, but, either way, keep speaking and keep listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.